Welcome to the Careers by Jen podcast, episode 217. This time on the podcast, Jen shares some ideas about how to make your next presentation memorable by wearing a singlet.
You're listening to the Careers by Jen podcast with me, Jen Swanson, the podcast that helps you to get the job, love your work, and advance your career. Do you have a work presentation that you have to give? Does this terrify you, or does it at least stress you out? Well, don't panic. Today's podcast will give you some practical tips to help make your next presentation memorable in a good way. Now, before we get to the topic of the day, you may have noticed there was no episode published last week. I was practicing what I preach by letting go when my plate was over full. And frankly, it was a choice between staying up until well after midnight to get it done, or not doing one last week and letting it just be. And so that's what I did. My work situation is such that my half-time ministry job, where I'm a pastor, as of this week, has been increased to a 0.75 or a three-quarter time job. And this is very exciting because I'm finally going to be able to do all of the things I wanted to do in that work. My little tiny church amalgamated or merged with another church so that now there's only one of this type of church in our town. And I'm going to be working with a partner in team ministry, and she and I will be both three-quarter time, and we've got tons of plans and there's lots of stuff going on, and I'm very, very happy about it. But it also means some other pressures that I have need to come off the plate. But don't worry, the podcast will still happen. It just might not be out every single week like it has been because other work and family time and self-care time sometimes has to come first. So please be patient. And again, I will still be putting out the same great content. And once I figure out how this new work rhythm is going to be, I may be back to producing a show every week. We'll have to see. I'm still facilitating every once in a while, doing the corporate training and taking on speaking engagements and things. So it's the balancing act and the juggling act. And we'll have to see. It takes many, many hours to put out one episode. And while I love doing it, it's not my main occupation. It's more of a labor of love, my friends. And yes, you are worth it. All right. So let's get to the topic of the day, how to make your next presentation memorable. And not just memorable, how to make it, so that people think about it after you finish speaking. I really struggled with the title of this episode. I wanted to say how to make your next presentation rock or shine or some other great adjective, but nothing sounded right. So what my goal is today is to help you feel good about the end result as best as I can by sharing some points with you. Now, I talk to people for a living as a corporate facilitator, which I happen to have been doing this afternoon at a law office, as a church pastor who preaches almost every week and does educational events and that kind of thing, as a keynote speaker and a workshop leader, and as a podcaster. Presentation is what I do. And I wasn't always as proficient at it as I am now. So I've learned a few things along the way, and I wanted to share with you some of the key things that you can do to make your presentation memorable and to feel good about it. So I've got 5 things, and the first one is to know your stuff. This is something I can't stress enough. If you've practiced your material, if you've prepared it thoroughly, if you've learned it, and notice I didn't say memorize, and I'll talk about why in a minute, then you can rely a little less on your notes and more on speaking out to the people in front of you rather than having your head down reading from your notes. Know your stuff. Practice it. And when you practice going off script a bit. Practice leaving your notes for a moment. Tell a story. Interrupt yourself when you're practicing. Have someone listen to your presentation and ask a question. And then see how easy it is for you to get back on track or not. Because it's easy when you're doing the presentation to be distracted. It's easy to lose your spot. And you want to be able to be distracted and then or interrupted or go off on a wee bit of a storytelling tangent if something occurs to you while you're speaking, and then to be able to get back on track. And that can happen if you know your content well. Now, memorizing, I think, is a bad idea. Why? Because it's dangerous. Now, that is unless you're doing some spoken word poetry or part of a play or a monologue or something where you have to memorize. Of course, that's different. But for a typical workplace presentation, you don't need to memorize. Knowing your material very, very well is preferable to memorizing, because if you've memorized it and then you get distracted or you think up something you want to add in the moment or you get interrupted with a question, then you can easily lose your place. And it's really hard to get back to something you've memorized without running it through your brain all over again, unless you have a full script in front of you. It's awkward, it's embarrassing, and it makes for not a very memorable experience, at least not in a good way. I watched somebody do this once. They had clearly memorized the presentation and it was going great until they got derailed. And then they had to pause and they turned beet red and it was very embarrassing. There was this, sort of quiet giggling and people didn't know quite what to do. And you could see the person running through the points in their head again before they came back to where they had left off and picked up again. But it really distracted the audience and lost the train of thought that they had been on, and it wasn't a good thing. So know your stuff. That's the first piece of advice that I have for you. The next piece of advice is know who is in the room. Who is your audience? Why are they there? Did they choose to be there, or have they been compelled to be there? Sometimes workshops or presentations can be mandatory. I did a whole series of them last spring on respectful workplace, fostering a respectful workplace, talking about harassment and discrimination. And you can bet those were not ones that people chose to take electively. They were mandatory. And it really helped to know that this was the case when I, as the presenter, was walking into the room. So find out if people were required or expected to attend your presentation. It's good to know. And find out also what these people do. Is your language and tone appropriate to the audience you are speaking to? Are you speaking their language, in other words? Are you using insider jargon and abbreviations? And if you are, will everyone listening know what you're talking about? Or will there be some guests there who aren't in on the jargon or the terminology? You want to be careful about that, because then you'll lose those people if they don't understand what it is you're talking about. Will everyone listening know those insider terminologies? And another one is, do you know any of their names? If you do know the people you're presenting to, that's one thing. But if you don't know them, can you meet them before you get into your presentation piece? Can you talk to some of them and then maybe bring their name up in the presentation? If you know the people in the room, then you'll be able to do that far more easily. Sometimes I try to do that, talk to people when they're entering the room or gathering, and then mention them or something about them in the presentation. If you know all of the people there, again, there may be an opportunity to do that when you're preparing the material. It makes it more personal. It makes it more relatable if you can know who is in the room. The third piece of advice is to speak from your heart. Now, I'm not getting all sappy here, and it sounds like a weird thing to say if you're presenting a budget or some other kind of report that might not lend itself to that. But what I mean is to speak to the people in the room and to put some of yourself into what it is that you're sharing, rather than having your eyes down reading a paper the whole time, or worse than that, talking as you read from the screen behind you. Have you ever seen that? Somebody who's talking and they turn around and they talk at the screen and you can't hear what they're saying when they do that? I'm not even going to mention PowerPoint slides that are too small and that are just an exact copy in tiny print of what you have in front of you, because those are just a waste of time. PowerPoint, I could do a whole podcast on how to do your slide presentation. I don't have time to do that right now, but that is unfortunate. So you want to be able to speak from the heart, and rather than have your eyes down reading the paper or reading the screen, when people can't see your face, then you're able to look out and you're able to look up. And honestly, most people can read the screen for themselves. Share what's great about what you're presenting. Share what's not so great. And if it's dry, is there a way to make it not so dry? Is there some kind of good news in what you're sharing, or some hope in the bottom line if it's a budget that you're talking about? Is there some kind of story that you can share about another organization that faced something similar to what you're facing? If so, tap into that and show your enthusiasm. Speak from your heart. In the summer, this past summer, I had to present to a ballroom at a hotel full of bankers. It was a half-hour presentation for about 350 or 400 people or so. And I had to do the same presentation 2 days in a row to two different groups of 350 or 400 bankers each day. It was a half-hour presentation, and I felt okay about the first one, but there was something missing. You know, I went on stage to the music blaring and all the rest of it. I did my presentation. People smiled, people laughed, people clapped, and I went off. But there was something missing. And after pondering it on the transit ride home, it occurred to me that I was focusing too much on my notes, and I was not speaking from my heart, and as I was not speaking from what I knew. So the next day, same exact presentation, I went for it. I looked at the audience. I spoke with passion and enthusiasm and shared from the heart. And the difference was night and day. Now, the first day had been good. It had apparently been better than good, according to one of the bank officials who had booked the presentation and who was there to watch and give me feedback. So I wasn't worried about that first day, but I didn't feel like I'd quite hit the mark. I didn't feel that surge of energy. I didn't feel like I was in the flow the way I do when I know that it's really coming across well. Well, the second day, the same bank official was beaming, and I knew immediately that I had made it memorable just because I had not concentrated on my script so much, and I had just spoken from the heart with enthusiasm. So speak from your heart. It makes such a difference. The fourth item that I have to share with you today is to tell a story. I just told you a story. Stories have value. Stories have impact. I can't remember what episode number it is, but I had an episode of the podcast called The Power of Storytelling. And storytelling helps people to remember what it is that you're sharing with them. It can illustrate your points in ways that facts and figures just can't. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out story either. Short is better, even. But the power of storytelling is often underestimated when you're giving a presentation. And so if you can share a story in your presentation, your efforts will be more memorable. And the better you get at storytelling, the better your presentations will be. Think of a TED Talk you heard that still resonates with you, or that you still think of once in a while. Or think of a podcast episode that you listened to, or a book that you read, or a speech that you heard. And those, likely what you will remember more than the facts and figures of these presentations, is a story. So find a story that brings your presentation to life and that people can connect with. And your presentation will be so much better. I even, when I was teaching communications and medical terminology, I used to have students do presentations quite a bit to get them used to speaking in front of people. And some of them got so creative. They'd bring in props, and they would, not just have slides on a screen and paper handouts. They'd bring in a prop that would be memorable. I remember somebody brought in a cake that was shaped like a tongue, because we were talking about the digestive system. This was a horrible looking cake. And I think there was also a Jell-O mold of a brain at one point. But the point is, they had some visuals. They had some, there was something there that was captivating and memorable. And many of them told stories. So those are the presentations that I remember better than, here's your endocrine system, and these are the hormones that are produced by the end, and these are the glands, like boring. So you want to have some story in there, and that takes a while to prepare, but it's so worth it. So tell a story. The fifth piece of advice on how to make your presentation memorable is this: be authentically you. Sometimes we pretend, sometimes we aren't real. We put on airs, or we put on voices that are not actually what we sound like or how we behave usually. And people can tell. Being authentically you is captivating. I was privileged just in March here last month to attend a conversation with Michelle Obama here in Vancouver as she talked about her book called Becoming. There must have been 15,000 people or something in the sports stadium that we were in, and the person who invited me had floor seats. So it was amazing to be up close and to be in the presence of someone who feels so real and so authentic. And despite being in this big sports stadium that was jam-packed, it felt intimate because, again, it felt like she was being real. She was being authentically who she is in a way that not all celebrities or famous people are able to do. And through story and through authentic conversation, the vibe was real. And it was inspirational. And I know that I will never forget that evening. On the train ride out of the city, complete strangers were smiling and chatting with each other about the experience and waving to each other as they got off the train. It was quite fascinating to see the atmosphere that was built in that space in that short amount of time. By somebody being authentic. So being authentic allows people to relate to you and to feel connected in ways they wouldn't if you showed up and pretended to be something or someone that you're not. So be authentically you, because only you can do that. Now, I could go on and tell you a bunch of other stuff, like that you need to sleep well before your presentation the night before and eat a good, healthy breakfast or lunch, depending on when your presentation is. And I can tell you where to put your hands and how to write your notes out. And I can tell you all of those things. And those are things that you can do and still not make your presentation memorable in a good way if you're not doing at least some of the 5 things that I've just offered in this episode. Know your stuff. Know who is in the room and who you're speaking to, and use their language. Speak from your heart. Tell a story. Tell more than one story if you have time. And be authentically you. I think these 5 things are enough to work on and to practice at and to implement. And if you do these things, I suspect your presentation will be good. And maybe it'll even be great. And that is what I wish for you. Thanks for listening, friends, and look after you. You've been listening to Careers by Jen with Jen Swanson. If you like what you heard, please share this. If every single person listening today shared this episode with just one friend, our audience would be twice as big just like that. And the more people we can help with our content, the better. So help out a friend and help grow our audience by sharing this show with someone you know who would benefit from the content. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, take good care.